In 1980, four nuns from a small town in Northern California vanished without a trace, leaving their close-knit community mired in grief and unsettling speculation. But 28 years later, a priest makes a shocking discovery, one that will unearth the horrifying truth of what really happened to them. Morning light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Agnes of Mercy Catholic Church, casting a kaleidoscope of color across the polished wooden pews. Father Elias Moreau stood at the altar, his voice solemn yet firm as he concluded the memorial service. May the souls of the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace, he intoned, making the sign of the cross. Amen. The congregation responded in unison. Father Elias looked out at the assembled faces, many elderly, some middle-aged, and a few younger parishioners. They had all gathered on this somber day to remember the four nuns who had disappeared without a trace exactly 28 years ago. The mystery had haunted the small Northern California town of Eldon Hollow for nearly 3 decades. As the service ended, Father Elias moved to the church entrance, greeting each member of the congregation as they filed out. Many offered condolences, though after 28 years, the words had taken on a ritualistic quality rather than conveying the raw emotion of fresh grief. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Harmon," Father Elias said, clasping the old woman's wrinkled hands in his. "Your presence means a great deal." "I always come, Father," she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can still remember Sister Mildred teaching my boys their catechism. Such a gentle soul." Father Elias nodded, feeling the familiar pang of sorrow. Sister Mildred Hayes had been 68 when she vanished, a lifetime of service to God, cut short by whatever tragedy had befallen her and the other 3 nuns. One by one, the parishioners departed, each carrying a different memory of the missing women. Sister Mildred Hayes, 68, Sister Joan Keller, 65, Sister Beatrice de Namora, 28, and the youngest, Sister Therese Moreau, 23. For Father Elias, the wound was deepest of all. Sister Therese was his biological sister, and her disappearance had shaken his faith to its very foundation. When the last of the congregation had gone, Father Elias walked slowly back through the now empty church. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he made his way to his private office at the rear of the building. The space was modestly furnished with a simple desk, a bookshelf filled with theological texts, and a window overlooking the church cemetery. Alone at last, Father Elias sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The composed facade he maintained for his parishioners crumbled, leaving only a man consumed by grief and unanswered questions. "Why, Lord," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, "I have served you faithfully all these years. My sister dedicated her life to you. Why have you not led me to them? What lesson am I failing to learn from this trial?" Tears seeped through his fingers as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. He rarely allowed himself this moment of weakness, but the anniversary always stripped away his carefully constructed defenses. After several minutes, Father Elias took a steadying breath and wiped his eyes. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small wooden box. Inside were several photographs, preserved with loving care despite the passage of years. The first was of Therese on the day she took her final vows. Her young face shone with joy and purpose beneath her wimple, and Father Elias felt both pride and a sharp pang of guilt as he gazed at the image. He had been the one to nurture her faith, to encourage her calling. He could still remember their conversations when she was just 16, her eyes alight with conviction as she spoke of her calling. "I was so proud of you," he murmured to the photograph. "I still am." The thought that had plagued him for 28 years crept back into his mind. If he had not encouraged her religious calling, would she still be here today? A mother, a teacher, alive and well, instead of, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit," Father Elias said sharply, making the sign of the cross to banish the treacherous thought. He could not allow himself to question God's plan, not even in his darkest moments. Setting aside Therese's photograph, he reached for another, the last known image of the 4 missing nuns. They were seated together on a wooden bench outside the small, remote chapel of St. Dymphna, near the edge of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. Sister Mildred and Sister Joan, the eldest, sat with their hands placidly folded in their laps, their wrinkled faces serene. Sister Beatrice sat beside them, her posture more relaxed, but her expression reverent, and next to her was Therese, the youngest, her eyes bright with purpose even in the faded photograph. The picture had been taken by a local visitor just days before the nuns disappeared. They had traveled to the St. Dymphna Chapel for a short spiritual retreat, 2 days of fasting, prayer, and silence before a Catholic saint's feast day. The diocese had also tasked them with assessing the state of the old chapel to determine if it should be restored or decommissioned. Sister Therese, with her keen eye for detail, had been assigned to document the structure's condition. Father Elias stared at the image, his mind drifting into calculations he had made countless times before. Sister Mildred would be 96 now, Sister Joan 93. Even if by some miracle they had survived whatever happened to them, they would be frail, elderly women. But Beatrice would be 56, and Therese just 51, still potentially in the prime of life. He remembered the frantic days and weeks after their disappearance. The police had searched the forest extensively, combing the undergrowth and scaling the slopes of the nearby mountains. Search parties had fanned out across surrounding farms, villages, and towns, but not a single clue had emerged. No scraps of clothing, no personal effects, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the 4 women had simply vanished into thin air. The official theory eventually settled on a bear attack. The Shasta Trinity National Forest was known for its wildlife, including black bears that could become aggressive if they felt threatened. Perhaps the sisters had wandered too deep into the woods and encountered a predator. But the complete absence of evidence always made this explanation ring hollow for Father Elias, and for many others as well. Over the years, uglier rumors had circulated. Whispers that the nuns had abandoned their vows and run away to start new lives. Father Elias and the church had worked tirelessly to quash such speculation, but the seeds of doubt had been planted in the community all the same. Therese would never have done that, he whispered, tracing his sister's face in the photograph. She would never have left without telling me. As he continued to gaze at the picture, his eyes drifted to the chapel in the background. St. Dymphna had been a simple structure built in the 1920s to serve the area's sparse Catholic population. Its white walls and modest bell tower were visible behind the nuns, surrounded by the towering trees at the forest's edge. Something tugged at Father Elias's heart as he studied the building. He had not visited St. Dymphna in over 20 years, finding the memories too painful to bear. But now, on this anniversary, he felt a strange compulsion to see it again, to walk where his sister had walked, to pray where she had prayed. Perhaps it was mere sentimentality, a desire to feel close to Therese on this difficult day. Or perhaps a small voice whispered in the back of his mind. There was still something to be discovered there, some clue overlooked in the initial investigation. This last thought was almost certainly foolishness. What could possibly be left to find after 28 years? Yet the pull was undeniable. Father Elias carefully placed the photographs back in the box, all except the one of the 4 nuns at St. Dymphna, which he slipped into his pocket. He rose from his desk, collected his Bible and rosary, and walked out of his office with purpose in his stride. In the church parking lot, he slid behind the wheel of his modest sedan, placed the photograph on the passenger seat beside him, and said a short prayer for guidance. Then he turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from St. Agnes, heading toward the forest and the ghosts of his past. The winding road that led from Eldon Hollow into the Shasta Trinity National Forest carried Father Elias through shifting landscapes. The neat homes and businesses of the town gave way to scattered farmhouses which eventually surrendered to the encroaching wilderness. Tall pines and cedars crowded the road, their shadows mottling the asphalt as he drove. The journey took about an hour and a half, giving Father Elias ample time to reflect. He found himself remembering the many times he had made this same drive in the weeks after the nuns' disappearance. Back then, his car had been filled with missing person flyers bearing Therese's face, and his heart had been buoyed by desperate hope. Now he carried only memories and a resigned acceptance of the mystery that had shaped his life. As the road narrowed and began to climb into the foothills, Father Elias slowed his vehicle. The St. Dymphna Chapel had been situated in a small clearing near the edge of the forest, accessible via a modest dirt track that branched off the main road. He scanned the roadside looking for the familiar turnoff. When he reached what he believed to be the correct location, Father Elias frowned in confusion. Instead of the simple dirt track he remembered, he found a paved private road blocked by an ornate gate. A no trespassing sign was prominently displayed, along with smaller notices warning of private property. "This can't be right," he murmured, pulling his car onto the shoulder of the road. He consulted the photograph he'd brought, comparing the background landscape with what he could see from his position. The mountains in the distance matched, as did the particular arrangement of taller trees on the ridgeline. This was undoubtedly the right location. But where was St. Dymphna's chapel? Father Elias got out of his vehicle and approached the gate on foot. Beyond it, he could see the private road stretching into the woods. But there was no sign of the white chapel building. Instead, the area appeared to have been extensively landscaped, with ornamental trees and shrubs lining the entrance. Bewildered, he reached for his cell phone and searched through his contacts until he found the number for Harold Gibbons, the longtime groundskeeper for St. Dymphna. They hadn't spoken in years, but Father Elias hoped the man was still in the area and could provide some explanation. The phone rang several times before a gravelly voice answered. "Hello? Harold? This is Father Elias Moreau from St. Agnes in Eldon Hollow." There was a pause, then recognition. "Father Elias, it's been a long time. How are you?" "I'm well, thank you," Father Elias replied, though it wasn't entirely true. "Harold, I'm standing at what I believe is the entrance to St. Dymphna, but the chapel seems to be gone." Another pause, longer this time. "That's right, Father. The diocese decommissioned the chapel years ago. It was sold off back in 1982 to a man named Silas Redwood. He had it torn down." Father Elias felt a chill despite the day's warmth. "I never heard anything about the chapel being sold, let alone demolished." "Well, after what happened with the sisters, attendance dropped off significantly. Then there was that incident with the bell tower cracking and nearly injuring poor Thomas Farrell. The bishop decided it wasn't worth the upkeep for such a small congregation." Father Elias found himself staring at the no trespassing sign with a growing sense of unease. "This Silas Redwood, does he still own the property?" "Oh yes," Harold confirmed. "He's got a pretty extensive piece of land back there. His main house is a ways in, near where the forest gets thicker. The chapel site is just part of his property now." "I see," Father Elias said slowly. "I was hoping to visit the chapel today for personal reasons. It's the anniversary, you know." Harold's voice softened with understanding. "Of course. 28 years today, isn't it?" I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, Father. Do you know if Mr. Redwood is generally receptive to visitors? Perhaps if I explained the situation. To be honest, he's not known for his hospitality, Harold replied cautiously. Something of a recluse from what I hear. Keeps to himself, doesn't mix much with the locals. Father Elias sighed, disappointment settling heavily on his shoulders. Well, thank you for the information, Harold. I appreciate it. Listen, Father, Harold said, his tone brightening slightly. I still live nearby, about 15 minutes from where you are now. I saved a few items from the chapel when it was shut down. The old altar cross, some prayer books, things like that. You're welcome to come by and see them if you'd like. That's very kind of you, Father Elias replied. I may do that, but first I think I'd like to try and speak with Mr. Redwood. Do you know how I might get to his main house? Harold hesitated. Well, there's the private road you're looking at, but that gate is always locked. There is, however, a public road that circles around. It'll get you close enough to the property. After getting directions from Harold, Father Elias thanked him and ended the call. He returned to his car, conflicted about his next move. A part of him felt he should respect Silas Redwood's privacy and head directly to Harold's house. But a stronger impulse urged him toward the public road that would lead him to the Redwood estate. 20 minutes later, Father Elias found himself driving along a narrow lane that skirted the edge of what must be Redwood's property. Through gaps in the trees, he caught glimpses of manicured grounds and eventually a substantial structure that resembled a mountain lodge more than a conventional house. The building was impressive. 3 stories of natural stone and timber, with expansive windows and multiple decks overlooking the forest. It spoke of a wealth that seemed at odds with the modest rural surroundings. Father Elias found a small pull-off near what appeared to be a service entrance to the property. He parked his car, straightened his clerical collar, and approached the imposing residence with a mixture of determination and apprehension. As he neared the main entrance, a stone path led him past carefully tended gardens and a small decorative pond. The craftsmanship of the place was undeniable. Yet Father Elias couldn't shake a sense of unease as he climbed the steps to the front door and knocked firmly on the heavy oak panel. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a tall, athletic man in his 60s dressed in expensive workout gear. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and in one hand, he held a leather dog leash. The man's expression shifted from neutral expectation to undisguised displeasure as he registered Father Elias's clerical attire. "Yes?" he asked, not bothering to hide the impatience in his tone. "Good afternoon," Father Elias said with a warm smile. "Are you Mr. Silas Redwood?" The man's jaw tensed. "I am, and you're trespassing. I apologize for arriving unannounced. My name is Father Elias Moreau from St. Agnes of Mercy Church in Eldon Hollow." He extended his hand, but Silas Redwood made no move to take it. "What do you want?" Redwood demanded, his fingers tightening around the dog leash. Father Elias lowered his hand, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the hostility. "I was hoping I might have a few minutes of your time. You see, I visited the site where St. Dymphna's chapel used to be, and I was surprised to find it gone. If you saw it's not there, then why are you here bothering me?" Redwood's voice had taken on an edge that was almost a snarl. "I spoke with Harold Gibbons, the old groundskeeper. He mentioned you had purchased the property. I simply wanted to—" "What? Blame me for buying a piece of land that was for sale?" Redwood took an aggressive step forward, causing Father Elias to step back involuntarily. "Are you one of those people who thinks that ground is somehow sacred? The diocese didn't seem to think so when they sold it." "No, no," Father Elias said quickly, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "I don't blame you at all. I was just curious about the circumstances. The chapel had personal significance for me, and I wasn't aware it had been demolished. Redwood seemed momentarily mollified, though his expression remained cold. Well, now you know. It's gone and good riddance. I sleep better now that I don't have to listen to that damned bell ringing 3 times a day and giving me migraines. Father Elias couldn't help but respond. The Angelus bell is a beautiful tradition, Mr. Redwood. It calls the faithful to recite the Lord's Prayer and honors the incarnation of God. It's meant to be a reminder of holy things, of our freedom from sin and death. Oh, spare me the sermon, Redwood scoffed. People can set alarms on their phones if they need to be reminded to pray. They don't need to disturb the entire countryside with medieval noise pollution. Clearly, the conversation was not progressing in a positive direction. Father Elias decided to try a different approach. I understand you value your privacy, Mr. Redwood, and I've intruded on your time. I apologize for that. Perhaps we could speak another day when it's more convenient for you. There won't be another day, Redwood said flatly. I have no interest in discussing a building that hasn't existed for decades with a priest I've never met before. Now, I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff and have you reported for trespassing. Father Elias nodded, acknowledging the futility of continuing. Very well. Thank you for your time, Mr. Redwood. Peace be with you. Redwood's only response was to shut the door firmly in his face. With a deep sigh, Father Elias turned and walked back down the stone path toward his car. The encounter had left him feeling both disappointed and unsettled. There was something in Redwood's manner beyond mere rudeness that suggested a deeper antipathy toward the church and its representatives. As he reached his vehicle, Father Elias glanced back at the imposing house. Was it merely his imagination, or was Redwood watching him from one of the upper windows? The sensation of being observed made the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, torn between heading back to Eldon Hollow and stopping at Harold Gibbons's home, as the man had invited him to do. Perhaps seeing some of the preserved artifacts from St. Dymphna's would provide the closure he had sought by coming here today. As he pulled away from the Redwood property, Father Elias found himself taking the road that would pass by the old chapel site. He couldn't explain the compulsion. He knew now there was nothing to see after all, but something drew him back in that direction. The car rounded a bend, bringing him within sight of the approximate location where St. Dymphna's had once stood. Through a break in the trees, he could make out a cleared area where the small building had been, now landscaped with ornamental shrubs. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, emitting a strange, haunting sound. Father Elias startled, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. The sound was unmistakable. Gregorian chant, the ancient ethereal music of monastic worship. But the radio was off. He distinctly remembered turning it off when he left Eldon Hollow. Father Elias pulled the car over to the side of the road and stared at the radio in bewilderment. The chanting continued for several seconds, then faded as abruptly as it had begun. "What on earth?" he murmured, reaching out to touch the radio dial. He switched it on and then off again. But the mysterious chant did not return. Had he imagined it? A trick of an exhausted mind, perhaps? Or some bizarre electrical malfunction in his aging vehicle? Yet as he sat there, a peculiar sensation washed over him, the same feeling he had experienced earlier while looking at the photograph in his office. A pull at his heart, an inexplicable certainty that he was meant to be here now, for a purpose he did not yet understand. The hair on his arms stood on end and a warmth spread through his ears. Physical sensations he had experienced before in moments of intense prayer or spiritual insight. In seminary, his spiritual director had taught him to recognize these as potential movements of the Holy Spirit. Once again, the faint chanting emanated from the silent radio, and this time Father Elias was certain he was not imagining it. It was as if a preternatural voice were calling to him, guiding him. Not fully understanding his own actions, Father Elias executed a careful U-turn and drove back toward the gate that blocked access to the old chapel site. Whatever was happening, he felt compelled to investigate further, even if it meant risking another confrontation with the inhospitable Silas Redwood. Father Elias parked his car on the shoulder of the road near the gate marking the entrance to Silas Redwood's property. The no trespassing signs loomed before him, their warnings clear and unambiguous. He sat for a moment with his hands still on the steering wheel, questioning the wisdom of what he was contemplating. "Lord, guide my actions," he whispered. "If I am about to err in judgment, show me the right path." But the strange sense of spiritual impetus persisted, and after one final moment of hesitation, Father Elias stepped out of his vehicle. He approached the gate cautiously, fully aware that he was considering trespassing, an action difficult to reconcile with his moral obligations as a priest. Yet the mysterious chant from his radio had awakened something in him, a conviction that transcended ordinary concerns. Instead of attempting to breach the gate itself, Father Elias began to walk along the perimeter of the fence, seeking a vantage point from which to observe the former chapel site. The fence was substantial, 8 feet of ornate but sturdy metal, but it followed the contours of the uneven wooded terrain, occasionally dipping lower to the ground where the earth rose beneath it. As he walked, Father Elias briefly closed his eyes, trying to visualize the layout of St. Dymphna's as it had once been. If his memory served him correctly, the wooden bench where the nuns had been photographed had stood to the east of the chapel, near a large oak tree. Opening his eyes, he scanned the property beyond the fence, trying to locate landmarks that might have survived the demolition. The oak tree was gone, presumably removed during Redwood's renovations, but a stand of pine trees that had been behind the chapel remained, providing a point of reference. Father Elias continued along the fence line, moving toward the area where he believed the chapel had stood. As he walked, his foot suddenly caught on an exposed tree root, sending him stumbling forward. He threw his hands out to brace himself, grabbing the metal fence, but the momentum of his fall caused his weight to press against a section where the fence posts were set in uneven ground. There was a sharp cracking sound as a weakened joint in the fence gave way, creating a gap just large enough for a person to slip through. Father Elias found himself sprawled partially on Redwood's property, the broken section of fence beneath him. "Oh, dear Lord," he muttered, pushing himself up and brushing the dirt from his clothes. He had not intended to damage the fence, let alone create a means of entry onto private property. Yet here he was, faced with an unexpected opportunity or temptation. Father Elias glanced back toward the road, making sure no one had witnessed his accidental vandalism. The area was deserted. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the late afternoon breeze. He looked down at the broken fence, then at the clearing beyond where St. Dymphna's had once stood. "Forgive me," he whispered, making the sign of the cross before carefully stepping through the gap in the fence. Once on Redwood's property, Father Elias moved quickly but cautiously toward the former chapel site. The area had been landscaped with non-native ornamental plants that looked out of place against the backdrop of the natural forest. Nothing remained to indicate that a place of worship had ever existed here. No foundation stones, no cross, no memorial of any kind. The absence struck Father Elias as particularly sad. It was as if Silas Redwood had deliberately erased every trace of the chapel's existence, removing not just the building, but its very memory from the land. As he stood contemplating this, a glint of reflected light caught his eye. Something near the ground, partially hidden by decorative shrubs. Curious, Father Elias moved closer and pushed aside the branches to reveal a metal grate embedded in the earth. A ventilation grate of some kind. It looked old and weathered, its iron bars rusted with age. Father Elias frowned, puzzled. If the chapel had been completely demolished, why would an old ventilation grate remain? And why would a landscaped area with no structures need ventilation at all? He crouched beside the grate, examining it more closely. The design was vintage, possibly dating to the 1930s or 40s, with ornate scrollwork around its edges. It seemed incongruous with the modern, minimalist aesthetic of the Redwood estate. As he leaned closer, a sound drifted up through the grate. It was so faint at first that Father Elias thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, a soft, melodic humming, followed by what was unmistakably a human cough. Father Elias's blood ran cold. The humming was reminiscent of the Gregorian chant he had heard on his car radio. But this was no electrical fault or figment of his imagination. Someone was underground, beneath what had once been St. Dymphna's chapel. "Hello?" he called softly through the grate, but the humming continued uninterrupted, suggesting the person could not hear him from their subterranean location. Father Elias straightened up, his mind racing. The implications were disturbing. Why would there be an underground space beneath the old chapel site? And more importantly, who was down there? He glanced around, half expecting to see Silas Redwood approaching with fury in his eyes. But the property remained quiet and seemingly unwatched, at least in this section. The main house was hidden from view by a stand of trees, and there were no visible security cameras in the immediate vicinity. Pulling his cell phone from his pocket, Father Elias dialed 911, his hand trembling slightly as he lifted the device to his ear. 911, what is your emergency? A female operator responded. My name is Father Elias Moreau, he said, keeping his voice low despite the apparent solitude. I'm on the property of Silas Redwood near the old site of the St. Dymphna Chapel off Route 37. He hesitated, suddenly aware of how bizarre his report was about to sound. I believe someone may be trapped underground. I can hear singing and coughing, coming from a ventilation grate. There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Sir, are you saying you suspect someone is being held against their will? I don't know, Father Elias admitted, but there seems to be an underground space of some kind, and someone is definitely down there. Given the remote location and the fact that this property is private, I'm concerned. Are you on the property legally, sir? The operator asked, a note of skepticism entering her voice. Father Elias winced. I accidentally damaged a section of the fence and found myself on the property. I realize I am trespassing, but this seemed like an emergency situation. I understand. What is your exact location on the property? Father Elias described his position as best he could, explaining he was near where the St. Dymphna Chapel once stood. We'll dispatch officers to investigate, the operator assured him. Please remain where you are until they arrive, unless you feel you are in danger. Thank you, Father Elias replied, relieved. I'll wait by my vehicle, which is parked on the side of the road near the main gate. After ending the call, Father Elias cast one last look at the mysterious ventilation grate. The humming had stopped, but as he listened intently, he could still hear the occasional sounds of movement from below. Someone was definitely down there, and the thought sent a shiver down his spine. He made his way back to the broken section of fence, carefully slipping through the gap and returning to the public road. As he walked toward his parked car, he dialed Harold Gibbons's number, feeling an urgent need to gather more information before the police arrived. Harold, it's Father Elias again. I need to ask you something important. When St. Dymphna was still standing, was there any kind of basement or subterranean room beneath it? Harold sounded surprised by the question. No, Father, the chapel was built on a simple slab foundation. No basement, no crypt, nothing of the sort. Why do you ask? Father Elias explained what he had discovered, the ventilation grate and the sounds coming from below ground. That's impossible, Harold said firmly. There was never any underground structure at St. Dymphna. I maintained that property for 20 years. I would know. Then the only explanation is that someone built it after the chapel was demolished, Father Elias concluded, when Silas Redwood took possession. That's unsettling, Harold admitted. What are you going to do? I've already called the police. They're sending officers to investigate. I'm coming over too, Harold decided. I know that property better than anyone. I can be there in 10 minutes. Father Elias thanked him and ended the call. Then he settled into his car to wait, running his fingers over the beads of his rosary and murmuring prayers for whoever might be trapped underground where St. Dymphna had once stood. Father Elias sat in his parked car, his fingers moving methodically over the smooth beads of his rosary as he recited the familiar prayers. The ritual brought a measure of calm to his troubled mind, though questions continued to swirl beneath the surface of his concentration. Who could possibly be underground at the old chapel site? What purpose could a subterranean chamber serve in such a remote location? And most disturbingly of all, could there be any connection to the disappearance of the 4 nuns 28 years ago? The last question seemed far-fetched even to Father Elias. 28 years was an impossibly long time for anyone to remain hidden. Yet the timing of his discovery on the very anniversary of the disappearance struck him as more than mere coincidence. An approaching vehicle from the direction of town interrupted his thoughts. It was a battered pickup truck that Father Elias recognized as belonging to Harold Gibbons. The old groundskeeper pulled up behind his sedan and climbed out of the cab, his weathered face etched with concern. "Father Elias," he called as he approached. "Any sign of the police yet?" "Not yet," Father Elias replied, getting out to greet him. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Harold nodded, his eyes scanning the road and the gated entrance to the Redwood property. "I've been thinking about what you told me. It makes no sense. If Redwood built something underground where the chapel was, people would have noticed the construction. You can't exactly dig out a basement without heavy equipment. Unless it was done gradually over time, Father Elias suggested. Or perhaps there was already some natural cavity in the ground that he expanded. Harold shook his head doubtfully. This area has no caves or anything of the sort. It's mostly solid rock under a few feet of soil. Before they could speculate further, the distinct sound of approaching sirens reached them. A patrol car rounded the bend, its lights flashing but siren fading as it pulled to a stop in front of Father Elias's car. 2 officers emerged, one older with graying hair at the temples, the other younger and leaner with an alertness in his movements that suggested a military background. Their nameplates identified them as officers from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. "Father Moreau?" the older officer asked, approaching with a professional but not unfriendly demeanor. "Yes, officer. Thank you for coming." Father Elias gestured to his companion. "This is Harold Gibbons, the former groundskeeper for the St. Dymphna Chapel that once stood on this property." The senior officer nodded in acknowledgement. "I'm Officer Williams, and this is Officer Reynolds. Dispatch says you reported hearing sounds coming from an underground location on private property. Can you explain to us exactly what you discovered?" Father Elias recounted the circumstances that had brought him to the area. His accidental breach of the fence and the discovery of the ventilation grate with sounds emanating from below. He was careful to emphasize his contrition for the trespassing, which Officer Williams acknowledged with a small wave of his hand. Let's focus on the potential welfare issue first, the officer said. If someone is indeed trapped or being held against their will, that takes precedence over a minor trespassing incident. Harold spoke up. I maintained St. Dymphna for over 20 years before it was sold. There was never any underground structure associated with the chapel. Whatever is there now was built after Silas Redwood took possession. The younger officer, Reynolds, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. Mr. Redwood is a prominent landowner in these parts. These are serious implications. I understand that, Father Elias said solemnly. I am not accusing Mr. Redwood of anything. I am simply reporting what I heard and expressing concern for whoever may be down there. Officer Williams nodded thoughtfully. Right. Let's have a look at this ventilation grate you discovered. Mr. Gibbons, since you're familiar with the property, would you mind accompanying us? Not at all, Harold agreed. The four men walked toward the damaged section of the fence. Father Elias pointed out the gap he had inadvertently created, and they carefully made their way through it onto the Redwood property. Father Elias led them to the ornamental shrubs that partially concealed the vent. Here it is, he said, pulling back the branches to reveal the rusted grate. Officer Williams crouched beside it, examining the vent with an experienced eye. This is old craftsmanship. It doesn't match the modern landscaping at all. Officer Reynolds joined him, shining a flashlight down through the grate. Can't see much. The shaft angles off after about 6 feet. Listen, Father Elias urged. Just be quiet for a moment. The four men fell silent, straining to hear any sound from below. For nearly a minute, there was nothing but the ambient noise of the woods. Birds calling, leaves rustling. Father Elias began to worry that whoever had been down there had moved away from the vent or had fallen silent upon hearing voices above. Then faint but distinct, a woman's voice began to hum. The tune was haunting, archaic, a fragment of sacred music that Father Elias instantly recognized despite its broken, faltering quality. Salve, Regina, Officer Williams whispered, a flicker of recognition crossing his weathered features. Harold nodded in confirmation. Yes, the Marian antiphon, sung in monasteries and convents for centuries. The humming continued for several more seconds. Then it faded, replaced by the sound of labored breathing and a dry, rasping cough. The officers exchanged a meaningful glance. Officer Reynolds straightened up, his expression now grave. There is definitely someone down there, and from the sound of that cough, they may need medical attention. We need to speak with Mr. Redwood immediately, Officer Williams decided. This is now a welfare check at the very least. I don't understand, Harold said, shaking his head in bewilderment. This vent wasn't here when the chapel was standing, and there was never any basement or underground room. How could anyone be down there? That's what we intend to find out, Officer Williams replied, his tone suggesting he had shifted fully into investigative mode. Let's go to the Redwood residence. The four men returned to the road in their respective vehicles, following the officer's patrol car as they drove the short distance to Silas Redwood's main house. The imposing structure seemed more intimidating than ever as they approached, its many windows like watchful eyes observing their arrival. Officer Williams instructed Father Elias and Harold to remain by their vehicles while he and Officer Reynolds approached the front door. Father Elias watched as the officers knocked and waited, the tension apparent in their stances despite their professional demeanor. Several moments passed before the door opened, but it was not Silas Redwood who emerged. Instead, the group saw him approaching from the rear of the property, still dressed in his workout clothes and leading a large German shepherd on a leash. His expression shifted rapidly from polite inquiry to barely contained fury when he spotted Father Elias and Harold standing near the officer's cruiser. What is the meaning of this? Redwood demanded as he reached the front steps. "Why are these trespassers on my property again?" Officer Williams introduced himself and his partner, explaining the purpose of their visit in measured tones. "We received a report of sounds coming from what appears to be an underground structure at the old chapel site. We'd like to ask you a few questions about it, sir." Redwood's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. First, this priest shows up uninvited, trespasses through my fence and onto my land, and now he's making wild accusations and wasting police resources." "No one is making accusations, Mr. Redwood," Officer Reynolds said calmly. "We are simply following up on a welfare concern. Someone appears to be in an underground space on your property, and they sound as if they may need medical attention." "That's absurd," Redwood snapped. "There is no one on my property except for me and my dogs. I would know if someone were living in a— what? A secret underground bunker? Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds?" "Nonetheless, sir, we are obligated to investigate," Officer Williams said firmly. "We would like permission to check your house and the grounds, including any basement areas." "Absolutely not." Redwood's hand tightened on the dog's leash, causing the animal to shift restlessly. "This is private property. You have no right to search without a warrant." "Mr. Redwood," Officer Reynolds began, his tone reasonable but insistent, "if there is someone in distress on your property, even a trespasser you're unaware of, wouldn't you want to know? It could be a squatter who has found their way into some old structure you don't even know exists." Redwood's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "There are no old structures I don't know about. I've owned this land for over 25 years. I know every inch of it." "Then what about the ventilation grate near the old chapel site?" Officer Williams asked. "The one that appears to be venting an underground space?" For a split second, something flickered in Redwood's expression. A momentary hesitation that Father Elias caught before the man's face hardened once more into stubborn denial. "I installed a drainage system when I landscaped that area," Redwood said dismissively. "What you're calling a vent is probably just a decorative grate covering a drainage pipe. There's nothing sinister about it." "A drainage system doesn't sing hymns or cough, Mr. Redwood," Officer Williams observed dryly. Redwood shot a venomous glare at Father Elias. "This man has clearly orchestrated this entire situation. He probably brought some device that plays recorded sounds and planted it near the drain. He's harassing me because he resents that I purchased church property." "I would never do such a thing," Father Elias protested, crossing himself. "As God is my witness, I heard a woman's voice coming from that grate. We all heard it, just a moment ago." Redwood scoffed. "A priest invoking God while he trespasses and lies? How typical." "That's enough, Mr. Redwood," Officer Williams said sternly. "We are requesting your voluntary cooperation," the officer said, his tone firm. "If you refuse, we will have no choice but to pursue other legal avenues." "Then pursue them," Redwood replied, his voice laced with ice. "In the meantime, I want these people off my property, immediately. If you are not gone in 2 minutes, I will press trespassing charges against all of you." Recognizing the impasse, Officer Williams nodded to Father Elias and Harold, signaling that they should return to their vehicles. The officers followed, walking back to their cruiser with measured steps that suggested this retreat was strategic, not final. Upon reaching the police car, Officer Williams spoke quietly to Father Elias. "Don't worry, Father, this is far from over. I'm going to contact dispatch and pull the property deed, the ownership history, and any prior complaints or incidents at this location. I also want to review the file on those missing nuns from 1980. Something isn't right here." Father Elias nodded gratefully. "Thank you, officer. I know how strange this must seem, but I truly believe someone needs help down there." "I believe you. We all heard something," the officer replied. "Whether it's exactly what you think, we'll determine that with a proper investigation." Go back to Harold's place for now. We'll be in touch. The drive to Harold's house was short but tense, both men lost in thought about the mysterious voice from beneath the old chapel grounds. Harold's home proved to be a modest cabin set back from the main road, surrounded by towering pines that cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. "It isn't much, but it's home," Harold said, leading Father Elias inside. The interior was simply furnished but comfortable, with well-worn furniture and walls decorated with fishing memorabilia and a few framed photographs. "It's very welcoming," Father Elias replied sincerely, his eyes drawn to a cross hanging prominently over the stone fireplace. Harold busied himself in the small kitchen, preparing tea while Father Elias settled into an armchair. "I saved several items from St. Dimphna's when it was decommissioned," Harold called over his shoulder. "They're in a trunk in the guest room. I'll show you after we've had our tea." Father Elias nodded, his mind still troubled by the ventilation grate and the haunting voice that had emerged from it. "Harold, why do you think the diocese never informed me about the sale of the chapel? I was at St. Agnes all those years ago and my sister was among the missing nuns. Surely someone should have consulted me." Harold returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to Father Elias before taking a seat opposite him. "The decision came from the bishop's office in Sacramento. I don't think it was handled well, to be honest. After what happened with the nuns, attendance dropped off significantly. Then there was the incident with the bell tower." "What happened exactly?" Father Elias asked, taking a grateful sip of the hot tea. "Structural failure," Harold explained. "The chapel was built in the 1920s and maintenance had been minimal. One Sunday morning, back in '81, the belfry developed a huge crack. The old bell must have weighed 300 pounds. It came crashing down, nearly killed poor Thomas Farrell, who was filling in as groundskeeper while I was laid up with a broken leg." "Was anyone hurt?" "By the grace of God, no. But it was the final straw for the diocese. They declared the building unsafe and closed it immediately. By early 1982, they had decided to decommission it altogether, rather than pay for repairs." Father Elias frowned. "And Silas Redwood bought it shortly after?" "That's right. Paid cash, from what I heard. More than the land was worth, which raised a few eyebrows. But the diocese needed funds for renovations at the cathedral, so they didn't ask questions." "What did Redwood do with the property immediately after the purchase?" Harold's brow furrowed in recollection. "He demolished the chapel right away. Had a crew in there within days. There were some protests from locals who thought the building could have been saved, but legally there was nothing they could do. After that, he started landscaping the grounds, but he never built anything substantial on the chapel site itself." "Did you notice any unusual construction activity? Anything that might suggest he was building something underground?" "Nothing obvious," Harold replied. Then he paused. "Although, there was a period in '83 when people reported hearing strange noises at night, machinery running, that sort of thing, and a few people complained about tremors." Father Elias leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Tremors? Like earthquakes?" "That's what the authorities concluded, minor seismic activity. But it seemed strange that it was localized to that specific area. Some people wondered if Redwood was doing some kind of excavation work." "And no one investigated further?" Harold shrugged. "A deputy came out, looked around, found nothing suspicious, and that was that. Redwood's always been, well, connected. He donates to the right causes, knows the right people." The conversation drifted to other topics. The changes in Eldon Hollow over the years, the dwindling congregation at St. Agnes, and theological discussions that reflected both men's deep faith. Time passed quickly, and Father Elias was startled when his phone rang, breaking the comfortable rhythm of their conversation. "Father Moreau speaking," he answered. "Father, it's Officer Williams." The officer's voice sounded energized, purposeful. "I've made some headway. I spoke with Judge Martinez, who is sympathetic to our concerns. She's granted an emergency order for a welfare check based on the reasonable suspicion of unlawful confinement." Father Elias felt a surge of hope. "That's excellent news, officer. We'll be heading back to the Redwood property within the hour. I wanted to let you know, though I must advise you to stay clear for safety reasons. This is now an official police operation." "I understand," Father Elias replied, though his desire to be present was powerful. "But officer, if you find anything, or anyone, you'll be the first civilian I call," Williams promised. "This whole situation began because of your persistence, Father. I respect that." After Harold heard the conversation, he insisted they should at least be able to observe from a distance, arguing their spiritual presence might be important if anything significant was discovered. With some reluctance, Officer Williams agreed they could remain in their vehicle at a safe distance, but strictly as observers. An hour later, Father Elias and Harold were parked along the public road near the entrance to Redwood's property. From their vantage point, they could see multiple police vehicles arriving, including a forensics van and an ambulance waiting nearby, a precaution that sent a shiver down Father Elias's spine. Officer Williams approached their car briefly. "We're going in with the warrant. I've set up my body cam to stream to this channel." He showed them how to access the feed on Father Elias's phone. "You can watch from here, but do not approach under any circumstances. Is that clear?" Both men nodded in agreement, and Officer Williams rejoined his colleagues. They watched as the assembled officers approached Redwood's front door, court order in hand. Through the phone's screen, they saw Redwood answer the door, his face contorting with rage at the sight of the officers and the document they presented. The audio was muffled but clear enough to hear him protesting vigorously, threatening lawsuits and calls to his lawyer. Despite his objections, the officers executed their search warrant, methodically examining the main house while Redwood was kept under supervision in his living room. After about 45 minutes, Officer Williams reported via the body cam that the house and conventional basement had revealed nothing suspicious. "Moving now to the forest path and outbuildings," Williams narrated for the benefit of those monitoring the feed. "Mr. Redwood has confirmed there is a storage shed along the private path connecting his main house to the old chapel site." Father Elias and Harold watched intently as the officers, accompanied by a visibly furious Redwood, made their way down the wooded path. The trail was well maintained but narrow, winding between ancient trees that created a tunneling effect in the fading daylight. After about a 15-minute walk, the camera showed a modest wooden structure, the storage shed Redwood had mentioned. It was larger than Father Elias had expected, perhaps 20 feet square with weathered siding and a metal roof. "This is just a tool shed," Redwood could be heard saying. "Garden equipment, maintenance supplies, that sort of thing. A complete waste of your time." The officers methodically searched the building, which did indeed contain an assortment of tools, lawn equipment, and landscaping supplies. The space was dusty and seemed little used, with cobwebs in the corners and a musty smell that one of the officers commented on. As the search was nearing completion, there was a sudden clatter. One of the officers had dropped a heavy wrench, which landed on the wooden floor with an unexpectedly hollow thud. The camera tilted down to show Officer Reynolds kneeling, experimentally tapping the floorboards. "This section sounds different," he observed, pulling out his flashlight to examine the area more closely. "These boards look newer than the others." Despite Redwood's renewed protests, the officers began to pry up the suspicious boards. Beneath them, they discovered a stone staircase descending into darkness. "Mr. Redwood," Officer Williams said, his voice coming through the body cam's microphone with clear authority. "Would you care to explain this?" Redwood's face had gone pale, his earlier bluster replaced by a tense silence. When he refused to comment, Williams instructed several officers to remain with him while he and Officer Reynolds prepared to descend the stairs. Switching to tactical lights, Williams narrated as he activated a powerful flashlight. "We are proceeding into the underground passage." The camera showed a narrow stone staircase that appeared to have been carved directly from the bedrock. The steps were worn in the center, suggesting regular use over a period of years. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy wooden door blocked further progress. "It's locked," Reynolds reported, examining the ancient iron mechanism. "Mr. Redwood, we need the key to this door." From above, Redwood's voice called out, still defiant. "I don't know anything about any door. It must have been here when I bought the property." The officers exchanged skeptical glances, and Williams instructed his colleagues to search for a key. One of them noticed a small recess in the wall beside the staircase, partially hidden by shadow. Inside was an iron key, green with age, but apparently functional. "Found a key," the officer reported, handing it down to Williams. The officer inserted the key into the lock, which turned with a loud, metallic groan. The door swung inward, revealing a dark tunnel beyond. "We are entering what appears to be a man-made tunnel," Williams narrated, his voice now quiet and tense. "Approximately 6 feet high, 3 feet wide. The walls are stone and earth, supported by wooden beams at regular intervals. Evidence of relatively recent construction despite attempts to make it look older." The officers proceeded cautiously through the tunnel, which stretched for what seemed to be several hundred feet. The passage curved slightly, and Father Elias realized with a jolt that it must be leading in the direction of the old chapel site. After a few minutes of walking, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The camera's light revealed rudimentary furnishings: a thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, a small table with the remains of what looked like food, and then from the shadows came a whispered voice. "Help! Is anyone there?" Officer Williams aimed his light toward the sound, and the camera revealed a frail, elderly woman lying on the mattress. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken but alert. Her gray hair was cut very short, and she clutched what looked like a hand-carved wooden rosary. "Ma'am," Williams said softly, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "I'm Officer Williams with the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. We're here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's cracked lips moved, forming words with visible effort. "Sister Therese. Therese Moreau." In Harold's car, Father Elias gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, "My sister. It's my sister." Harold placed a steadying hand on his arm, his own expression one of shock and disbelief. Through the body cam, they could see that the small chamber was lined with religious carvings: crosses, saints, biblical scenes, all apparently created from scraps of wood and stone. A single candle stood on the makeshift table, long since extinguished. On one wall, a large cross had been meticulously etched into the stone. "Sister Therese," Officer Williams was saying, his voice professional but kind, "we're going to get you medical attention right away. Can you tell me if there is anyone else down here with you?" The woman's gaze shifted to a dark corner of the chamber, where the camera's light had not yet reached. "Beatrice," she whispered, "but she has gone to God many years ago." The camera panned to reveal what appeared to be human remains, a skeleton lying on a similar mattress, partially covered with a tattered blanket. "We need medics down here immediately," Williams said into his radio, his voice taut with controlled emotion. "And notify the forensic unit. We have human remains as well." Unable to restrain himself any longer, Father Elias bolted from the car, ignoring Harold's protests. He ran toward the police perimeter, where an officer tried to intercept him. "Please," Father Elias begged, his voice cracking. "That's my sister they've found. I'm Father Elias Moreau. She's been missing for 28 years. I have to see her." The officer, recognizing the name from the earlier report, spoke into his own radio. After a brief consultation, he escorted Father Elias through the perimeter to where the forensic team and paramedics were preparing to enter the tunnel. "Wait here, Father," the officer instructed. "They'll be bringing her out soon." Time seemed to stretch as Father Elias waited, alternating between praying and trying to process the reality of what was happening. After what felt like an eternity, activity at the entrance to the shed increased. Officers emerged, followed by paramedics carefully carrying a gurney. On it lay Sister Therese, so thin and frail she barely made an outline beneath the blanket covering her. As they passed where Father Elias stood, her head turned slightly, and their eyes met. Despite the ravages of time and suffering, he recognized his sister in those eyes. Eyes that had once shone with youthful devotion, now pools of unfathomable experience. Her lips moved, and though no sound emerged, Father Elias could read the words she formed. "God never abandoned me." As the paramedics rushed her toward the waiting ambulance, another group emerged from the shed carrying a body bag. "Sister Beatrice," Father Elias presumed. The sight sent a fresh wave of grief through him, tempered only by the miracle of his sister's survival. Amid the activity, he saw Silas Redwood being led away in handcuffs, the man's former arrogance replaced by a sullen, defeated expression. As Redwood passed, he suddenly lunged forward and spat directly at the priest, the spittle landing on his cheek. "Proud of yourself, Father?" Redwood taunted before the officers yanked him back. Father Elias calmly wiped his face, his voice steady as he replied, "I count it a joy to have suffered as my Lord did." As Redwood was led away, Father Elias overheard snippets of conversation between officers discussing what they had found. One mentioned the discovery of a second set of skeletal remains in another chamber, speculating they might be Sister Beatrice, who had been about the same age as Therese when she disappeared. Harold appeared at Father Elias's side, having followed at a more cautious pace. "The ambulance is ready to leave," he said softly. "We should follow them to the hospital." Father Elias nodded, his heart too full for words. Together they returned to Harold's car and followed the ambulance as it sped away from Silas Redwood's property, its sirens wailing, carrying the miraculous survivor of a 28-year nightmare toward the light of freedom at last. The lights of the emergency entrance cast harsh shadows across the ambulance bay as paramedics wheeled Sister Therese through the sliding doors. Father Elias and Harold had arrived moments later, parking hastily and rushing toward the entrance, only to be intercepted by hospital staff. "I'm sorry, Father," a nurse said, her tone firm but compassionate. "You can't go in with her right now. The medical team needs room to work. She's in extremely fragile condition." "I understand," Father Elias replied, though every fiber of his being longed to remain by his sister's side. "But I'm her only living relative. She's been missing for 28 years. I thought she was dead until today." The nurse's expression softened. "The doctors will do everything they can for her. There's a waiting room just down that hall. I promise someone will come speak with you as soon as possible." Reluctantly, Father Elias allowed Harold to guide him to the waiting room, a sterile space with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, the magnitude of the day's events too overwhelming for casual conversation. Finally, Harold spoke. "It's a miracle, Father, after all these years, to find her alive." "A miracle indeed," Father Elias agreed, his voice thick with emotion. Though I dread what she must have endured to survive. She had her faith, Harold said simply. Sometimes that's enough. Father Elias nodded, drawing comfort from the thought. He remembered the religious carvings that had lined the underground chamber, evidence that even in the darkest captivity his sister had held fast to her devotion. I should call Saint Agnes, he realized suddenly. The congregation needs to know she's been found. As he reached for his phone, it rang in his hand. The screen showed Officer Williams's number. Officer? Father Elias answered. I'm at the hospital. My sister is being treated now. I'm glad to hear that, Father, Williams replied. I'm calling to update you on the investigation. We've secured Silas Redwood in custody, but he's refusing to speak without his lawyer present. However, we found something significant when we searched his house more thoroughly. A journal. It seems he's been keeping detailed records for decades. A chill went through Father Elias. What kind of records? It's disturbing content, Father. The journal contains extensive writings about his hatred for the Catholic Church, and for religious women in particular. There are entries dating back to the late 1970s describing his obsession with the nuns from St. Dymphna's. But why? Father Elias asked, struggling to comprehend the depth of hatred required to commit such crimes. What possible motivation could he have had? There was a brief hesitation before Williams continued. According to his writings, Redwood's mother abandoned him as an infant, leaving him with his grandmother. She later became a nun. He never met her, never even saw her. His grandmother, who raised him, was apparently a strict Catholic who physically abused him in the name of religious discipline. He developed a pathological hatred for nuns, viewing them as women who abandon their natural duties to their families. Father Elias closed his eyes, a wave of sorrow washing over him. So much brokenness, he murmured. Such twisted thinking. There's more, Father, Williams went on, his voice grim. The journal details what happened to the other nuns. The two older sisters, Mildred Hayes and Joan Keller, apparently died within the first year of captivity. Given their age and the conditions they were kept in, it's not surprising. May their souls rest in peace. Amen, Father Elias whispered, crossing himself. Sister Beatrice survived longer, nearly a decade, according to Redwood's entries. She died in the early 1990s from what appears to have been an untreated respiratory infection. And my sister? How did she survive when the others didn't? Williams hesitated again. Father, there are aspects of Redwood's journal that are particularly distressing. He seems to have developed a fixation on Sister Therese. He kept her separated from the others, especially after Sister Beatrice died. There are photographs in the journal that suggest he subjected her to degrading treatment. Father Elias gasped, a surge of nausea rising in his throat. Dear God, no. I'm so sorry, Father. The evidence indicates he was physically and psychologically abusive toward her for years. It's remarkable she maintained her sanity under such conditions. My sister did not sin, Father Elias said firmly, as much to himself as to the officer. She was a victim. The sin belongs entirely to her captor. Of course, Father, Williams agreed solemnly. No one would ever suggest otherwise. Harold, who had been listening to Father Elias's side of the conversation, placed a supportive hand on his shoulder. There's one more thing you should know, Williams continued. The journal details how he managed to abduct 4 nuns without anyone finding them. It was a meticulously planned operation. Redwood had been watching St. Dymphna's for months, learning the nuns' routines. When he learned they would be alone for their retreat, he saw his chance. How did he get them out without leaving any evidence? Father Elias asked, recalling how the investigation had been stymied by the complete absence of any sign of a struggle or forced entry. According to his writings, he posed as a friendly neighbor bringing tea and supplies to the chapel. The tea was drugged. The two older nuns drank it and became drowsy. When the younger nuns helped them to bed, Redwood entered and overpowered them one by one. He started with the older nuns, who were frail and easier to subdue. "Your sister almost got away. She fought back, nearly made it to the door, but he knocked her unconscious and then drugged her as well." Father Elias shuddered, imagining his sister's terror. He moved them out through a service corridor in the old chapel, loading them into his vehicle during the night. Afterwards, he meticulously cleaned the chapel, burning all evidence: their bags, letters, bedding. He even washed the floors with bleach to destroy any trace. By the time the alarm was raised, there was nothing to find. "And the police investigation?" Father Elias asked, remembering the frustration and helplessness he had felt during those first few weeks. "Rural investigations in 1980 weren't what they are today," Williams explained. "Resources were limited, forensic techniques were less advanced, and record-keeping was spotty at best. Once the initial searches turned up nothing, the case quickly went cold. Redwood himself was never considered a suspect. He was wealthy, respected in the community, had no criminal record. And then he bought the chapel through a holding company." Father Elias concluded, the pieces falling into place. "He demolished it to make sure no one ever looked there again." "Exactly. After he bought the property, he built the underground chambers and the tunnel connecting them to his storage shed. That explains the reports of late-night construction noise and tremors back in 1983. "How could nobody have noticed?" Harold interjected, his voice rising with indignation. Father Elias relayed the question to Williams, who sighed audibly. "It's not something I'm proud to report, but Redwood's journal suggests he bribed certain officials to ignore complaints and look the other way during the construction. We'll be investigating those allegations thoroughly." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a doctor in surgical scrubs approaching with a clipboard in hand. "Are you Father Moreau, Sister Therese's brother?" Father Elias quickly ended his call with Officer Williams, promising to speak again soon, and turned to the doctor. "Yes, that's me. How is my sister?" The doctor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes but a serious expression, took a seat across from them. "I'm Dr. Chen. Your sister is in stable condition, but I want to be frank with you. Her health is extremely compromised. She is severely malnourished, has significant muscle atrophy, vitamin D deficiency from the lack of sunlight, and shows signs of healed fractures that were never properly set." Father Elias nodded, trying to absorb the clinical assessment of his sister's suffering. "The most immediate concern is reintroducing her to normal environmental conditions," Dr. Chen continued. "After decades underground, her immune system is severely compromised. We need to be careful about potential infections, and her eyes will be sensitive to normal levels of light for some time." "When can I see her?" Father Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She's being settled in the ICU now," Dr. Chen replied. "We need to be extremely cautious with visitors. Anyone who enters must wear protective gear, mask, gown, gloves, to minimize the risk of introducing pathogens. Even with those precautions, I can only allow very brief visits initially." "I understand," Father Elias said, though the prospect of more delay was agonizing. "I've waited 28 years. I can wait a few more hours to ensure her safety." Dr. Chen smiled gently. "She asked for you, you know. One of the first things she said was her brother's name. She knew you would find her eventually." Tears welled in Father Elias's eyes at this revelation. "She never lost her faith." "Apparently not," Dr. Chen agreed. "The paramedics reported she was clutching a rosary made from what looked like scraps of wood and threads of clothing. She refused to let them take it from her even during treatment." "That sounds like Therese," Father Elias said, a sad smile crossing his face. Her faith was always stronger than mine, even when we were children. You'll be able to see her in about an hour, Dr. Chen promised, standing. A nurse will come get you when she's ready for a visitor. As the doctor left, Father Elias turned to Harold. Would you mind if I spent some time in the chapel? I need to pray. Of course, Harold replied. I'll wait here in case there's any news. Father Elias made his way to the small hospital chapel, a modest space designed to accommodate various faiths. Finding it empty, he knelt before the simple altar and bowed his head. Thank you, Lord, for this miracle, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Thank you for preserving my sister through her terrible trial. Thank you for guiding me to her after all these years. He continued in silent prayer for some time, wrestling with the complex emotions surging within him. Joy at his sister's discovery, grief for her suffering, rage toward her captor, and the persistent, haunting questions of why God had allowed such evil to endure for so long. At last, a sense of peace settled upon him. The mysteries of God's ways remained, yet Father Elias found himself accepting that some questions might never be answered in this life. What mattered now was that his sister had been found, and that somehow, through an unimaginable darkness, her faith had endured. When he returned to the waiting room, Harold was speaking with a nurse who had come to escort Father Elias to the ICU. After donning the required protective gear, he followed her through a series of doors to a private room where his sister lay, surrounded by medical equipment. The figure on the bed barely resembled the vibrant young woman who had disappeared 28 years ago. Sister Therese's face was gaunt, her skin made pale by decades without sunlight. Yet when her eyes opened and met his, Father Elias instantly recognized the inner light that had always defined her. A spiritual radiance that not even the darkest captivity had managed to extinguish. Elias, she whispered, her voice thin but clear. You found me. Therese, he answered, tears streaming beneath his protective mask as he gently took her frail hand in his own gloved one. I never stopped looking. I never stopped praying. A shadow of a smile touched her chapped lips. I knew you wouldn't. I told Beatrice God would send you to us one day. I'm sorry it took so long, Father Elias said, his voice breaking. Sister Therese shook her head slightly. God's time is perfect, always perfect. The nurse gently touched Father Elias's shoulder, indicating that his time was up. He nodded in understanding. I'll be right outside, he promised his sister. I won't leave the hospital. We have so much to talk about when you're stronger. Tell me one thing, Sister Therese whispered as he turned to leave. The church, is it still strong? Father Elias smiled beneath his mask. The gates of hell have not prevailed against it, he assured her, quoting Christ's promise in the Gospel of Matthew. Rest now, sister. God is with you, and so am I. As he left the room, Father Elias felt a profound sense of awe. His sister's first concern after everything was for the church rather than for herself. Despite all she had endured, her priorities remained firmly aligned with her calling. It was a testament to a faith that transcended circumstance, a faith that had sustained her through 28 years of darkness and would now guide her back into the light.